God has given us a new day, and we thank the Lord for this day. A new day means a new opportunity, an opportunity to respond to who God is and also what He has done and what He continues to do in each one of our lives. So, how do you respond? How do I respond to God's grace in our lives today? Are we full of gratitude? Are we filled with awe and thanksgiving at this awesome God that has done so much on our behalf, even though we did not deserve His grace? Or have I gotten used to His work in my life? And is it just something repetitive? I just come to church on a Sunday morning because I have to check off a box in my agenda. And my prayer is that this morning, this new day, would be a day in which we reflect and we appreciate the work of God in our lives. A while back, we started a sermon series called Speaking Up About Christ. And in this political climate, in the way that things have gotten so charged in society, we started talking about this idea that as people are standing up and speaking up about what they believe politically or socially, as Christians, we should stand up and speak up about the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. And we had a couple of sermons addressing this topic. The first sermon was speaking up about Christ by sharing the gospel. And we went through the Romans road and explained how you tell someone about Jesus by sharing the gospel. Second, we spoke on how to speak up about Christ by starting a conversation. Starting a conversation with someone like Jesus did with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. Today, we're going to talk about speaking up about Christ by sharing your testimony, sharing your personal story, what God has done in your life. And then probably next week or in the next couple of weeks, we will finalize the series by speaking on the topic, Speaking Up About Christ, Defending the Faith. We have opportunities as we're having conversations with people to be apologists that defend the faith. And as we defend the faith, God can open a person's mind so that they would come to know Jesus Christ as Lord. So today, speaking up by sharing our personal testimony. Every year, there's a group from this local church. We go to Fresno, California, and we are a part of a great event called the Bill Glass Behind the Walls Prison Ministry Outreach, where for a weekend, you go and you just share the gospel in the prisons of California, namely in Fresno, California. And there's a man there, his name is Jack Murphy, or people call him Murph the Surf, and he's someone that works with the Bill Glass organization, and this is a man that has had a very dramatic encounter with the Lord and has a very dramatic testimony, if you will. Back in the 1960s, as a con man, he performed one of the greatest heists in American history, where he stole 24 stones that were very valuable, and one of them was called the Star of India, a prestigious precious stone. And then later on in that same decade, after getting out of prison, he was convicted of a double homicide. And this guy was supposed to go to prison, and they were going to throw away the key because he was never getting out. But then, in 1974, the same Bill Glass ministry went into the Florida prison where he was detained, and he heard the gospel message. He heard about a Jesus Christ that could save even a con man, that could save even a murderer. He accepted Christ, radically transformed his life, and he began in prison as an inmate, sharing the gospel and being a vessel for the Lord. And in miraculous ways that people still cannot explain, this man was released from prison in 1986, and for the last 35 years has been going back into prisons, sharing his testimony, the dramatic way that God worked in his life. Well, this morning, we have the story or the testimony of a demon-possessed man in Mark chapter 5. And this is also a very dramatic personal testimony. It's dramatic, just as Brother Ovidio was sharing, because this was a man that was no longer a man. You could say he acted like an animal. He was a person that lived in the tombs. He was a man that howled like a wolf. He was a person that people were terrorized of. They had probably tried to give him sedations and put him down in some way to control him with chains and shackles, but nothing worked. However, when this person came into contact with the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, as verse 15 was already read, he sat at the feet of Jesus quietly, and he was a transformed man. Now, you might be here this morning as a Christian, as someone that maybe grew up in the church, and you're going to say, my personal testimony is not that traumatic. There's not much I can tell someone in order to convince them that life with Jesus is the greatest choice a person can make on planet Earth. And sometimes we'll hear these stories and it's almost like they dissuade us from sharing our own testimony. But I want to encourage you this morning as we're going to go through and just share a few principles of how we should share our testimony. I want to encourage you that your testimony is important because each one of us has been in the world, even if it was just in our minds, even if the devil had a shackle just on a mind level. We were all possessed like the demon-possessed man. We were possessed in our addictions. We were possessed in our pornography. We were possessed in our anger and our hatred. And Jesus brought a day in our life. He brought a season when there was transformation. When He came and He stopped in front of you and in front of me and said, I want you to be my child. That is powerful. You don't need to have a formidable past of egregious sin in your life. We are all fallen and fall short of the glory of God. Without Jesus, we are all damned to hell. But Jesus came, He saved us from our sins, and today we can call Him Lord. That's something worth telling the world. And I want to encourage you to share your testimony. Hallelujah. Today, we're going to look at the Mark chapter 5 passage, and we're going to share a few principles of how we should share our testimony. How should when I come into contact with a friend, a coworker, I get that opportunity, whether it's 5 minutes or a half hour, what are some things that I should keep in mind as I share about how God has worked in my life? Because in the end, that's what a testimony is. Jesus says at the end of this passage to the man that had been demon-possessed, verse 19, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you. A testimony is very simply telling other people of what the Lord has done in your life and in my life. Anybody can do that. You don't have to have a special degree. You don't have to be educated and sophisticated. Anyone can tell of what God has done in their life. So 5 principles that we should keep in mind as we share our testimony with people that we come into contact with. Number 1, when sharing our testimony, emphasize the power or the greatness of God. Emphasize how great God is. If you look at the story of the demon-possessed man, we can see throughout the story that, yes, even though there is a devil, yes, even though there are demons, and in this particular case, it was a legion of demons that had possessed this man, these demons were no match for Jesus Christ, who's at a whole nother level. He's in a league of his own. He controls and he conquers and he dominates even the powers of darkness. We see in verse 7 that this man recognized that Jesus is the Son of the Most High God. Now imagine being someone on the sidelines and you're seeing two forces duking it out against each other, and one of them recognizes, hey, this guy is the real deal. He's the Son of God. He's the Creator. He's the Alpha and the Omega. Wouldn't that give you a sense of faith that, yes, this Jesus is the real thing, and I'm going to believe what he testifies? If we continue and we look in verse 9, Jesus demands that this demon, that this legion, speak its name. And you would think that the demons would sort of hold back, and even though it might have been forced, in the end, they say, yes, our name is Legion. And finally, we see in verse 12 that the demons want to exit this person and go into a herd of swine. But interestingly enough, they asked Jesus for permission. They asked Jesus, can I please enter into this herd of swine? Which again, very clearly shows the dominance of Jesus Christ and his power. And finally in verse 15, we see a man who had had a past, a man who was demonized, who was violent, who terrorized the people around him. We see the power of Jesus Christ in that he brought transformation to such a man. And now we see him calm. Now we see him at the feet of Jesus. And we see that he's in all his full in his mental capacities. When we share our testimony, let's make sure that the emphasis falls on the power of God, the way that this power worked in our lives through the scripture, through the message, through the encounter that we had. We have a powerful God that works in our life, and he can work in the life of the individual that we're sharing our testimony with. So number one, as we share our testimony, emphasize the power and the greatness of God. Secondly, when sharing our testimony, resist the lies of the enemy in regards to you and I. As you're sharing your testimony, there's going to be that voice that tries to persuade you not to share your testimony. And people fall into two categories. There are people that have a past, like Jack Murphy or like the demon-possessed man, and the devil comes and he says, man, you don't want to tell people that you had that kind of a past. What are they going to think about you? That's too much for people to handle. That's too much for you to give in regards to your testimony. We're able to see in our passage that when Jesus delivers this man, we see in verse 17 that after he had performed this exorcism and the demons come out of this man, people from town come into Jesus, and it says in verse 17, then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. Why would you want Jesus to leave? He had just done something extraordinary. He had just brought peace to your city. He had removed the terror that had been terrorizing that region, and yet you're asking Jesus to leave. Why? Because they had been deceived to think that this was just too much. It's just too overwhelming. And of course, their profit had been taken from them because they cared for the swine, and now that profit margin had been taken away from them. But that's the attitude of a lot of people. I'm just not going to share my personal testimony because people are going to judge me. I'm not going to share my personal testimony that I dealt with addiction, that I dealt with certain things in my life because I'm afraid of what man will say. And I want to challenge you this morning, be not afraid primarily of what other people are going to say about you, but fear the Lord and allow him to tell you how much of your personal testimony to share. And as we'll see in the points to follow, We're not going to put the emphasis on the negative things that have happened in our life, but there are some things that you should share. There are some things that should shed the light on the fact that we were wicked sinners, but now, saved by God's grace, we are saints, not because of what we've done, not because we're so great, but because of the power of God in our lives. But then there are people that are on the other extreme, and as I mentioned earlier, because they don't feel like their testimony, they don't feel like their history is that significant. Well, I dealt with a little bit of lying here. I dealt with a little bit of greed here. But there's not much that I can say. And the devil deceives people not to share their testimony because they feel like there's not that much I can share with people. I grew up in a Christian home, and there's really nothing a person can relate to from my life. They come from the world. They've been out there partying. I grew up in a church as a good boy, as a good girl. What can they learn from me? And once again, I tell you, God can use even something that you call ordinary in order to do something extraordinary. We see in Scripture again and again how God takes the ordinary things, or at least the things that we see as ordinary, and He does extraordinary things, powerful things for His kingdom. We see a little boy that has 5 breads and 2 fish, and Jesus takes that and He performs the miraculous. We see Jesus taking 12 regular, ordinary fishermen, people that you would not characterize as impacting society, and through those people in a supernatural way, He turns the world literally upside down. He brings the gospel to humanity, and that gospel has gotten to us today as well. Why? Because God used the ordinary in order to do something extraordinary. Your ordinary personal testimony can be something supernatural that brings transformation into the life of your classmates, someone that you work with at your school or at your workplace. God can use that in order to pierce a person's heart, to open their heart to the gospel so that you can tell them about a Jesus Christ that saves from sin. Hallelujah. Thirdly, when sharing our testimony, give a snapshot of your life before Christ. Talk about what was there before you encountered Christ. And I know that this is where things can be sort of sensitive because people go to the extremes. But we see from our passage that there are some details that are given in regards to the man that was demon-possessed. And we see in verses 2 through 5 that the guy lived in tombs. We don't get the details as to why he was in the tombs, as to what he was doing inside the tombs, but we do get this picture, this snapshot, that this guy was in tombs. The Bible also tells us that they tried to tie him down with chains and shackles. We don't know exactly why they did this. We don't know if he had tried to kill people. We don't know if he had tried to steal their property. We don't have that additional detail, but we have a snapshot that he was yelling out in the fields day and night, that he was cutting himself with rocks. So we get a snapshot, but we don't necessarily get a detailed video of what he was doing. And the reason that I want to share this with you this morning is because it's important for people to hear your past. So give them a snapshot of your past, but don't glorify your past. There are those people that they talk about their past as if it was something great. It was magnificent. Do you know how bad I was? You think you were bad? I was way worse than you. And it's almost like a competition as to who is worse or who had a worse past. That shouldn't be the attitude of a Christian. We should weep at our past. We should weep about the fact that we were far away from the Lord and that we didn't please Him and that we did things that disobeyed God. But at the same time, we want to show the reality and the graveness of sin and the fact that without Jesus, we're going to live in addiction, we're going to live in fear, we're going to live in anxiety. But then again, there are people on the other side, they don't glorify the past, but they completely ignore it. Well, everything's under the blood of Jesus now, so I'm not even going to share anything from my past. And again, it's something that has to do with fear. It's something that has to do with not having the faith that what's in the past is in the past and that it doesn't have control over me anymore. And I can tell from the rooftops that yes, I was a sinner, but now I'm saved by the grace of Christ, and I can live not in my own strength, but because of a Jesus that sustains me. So thirdly, give a snapshot of your past. Tell people, what are some things that you dealt with before you came into contact with Jesus? Fourth, when sharing our testimony, explain or express your encounter with Jesus Christ. That moment when you saw the hand of God, when I saw the hand of God reaching down and saving me from my wretchedness. And if we look at our text, we see an encounter, again, that in this situation, it was very dramatic. It was a situation in which the two forces, the evil, the dark, and the light are almost coming into combat with one another. Of course, Jesus showing that he's all powerful and that there's no match for him by the devil. If we look at verse 6, it says that the man came to Jesus and worshiped him. Of course, this was just kind of a ploy. Then in verse 7, he asked Jesus not to torment him. Verse 8, Jesus tells the spirit to come out, asks him to identify himself, and then finally Jesus gives permission for the demon to exit the man and go into the swine who go off the cliff. And in verse 15, we see this man who's just at the feet of Jesus. And I'd be curious to ask him, what's going on through his mind? What's happening in that moment as he's at the feet of Jesus? He sees that his life is completely different. Maybe up to this point, it had been this bad nightmare and this bad dream, and all of a sudden there's clarity for him. All of a sudden there's a peace where he's just sitting down quietly. All of a sudden, he's able to recollect maybe memories from his past, from his childhood, that he may not have been able to recollect. Tell people your encounter with Jesus Christ. What happened in that moment? Where were you at the moment or in the season when Christ touched your life? Maybe as a young person, it was at a youth camp or at a prayer circle. Maybe you were sitting down with someone having conversation, and as they shared the gospel with you, it just made sense. It was as if God was speaking directly to you in that moment. Allow people to see the moment, to open their eyes by giving them an insight into your own experience so that they would see this is what God did in that moment. Explain to them what you felt as a result of God's intervention in your life. I was anxious, and all of a sudden I began to feel God's peace. I was full of fear, and now I had joy that was just tremendous, and it was something that I could not explain. Share your experience, because through that experience, God can create an appetite into the life of an individual who maybe up to that point, they had heard about Jesus Christ. They had heard that God exists. They had heard that the Bible is real. But now it's not just theory. Now my friend, now my brother, now my coworker is saying that this reality has happened in his life, and it puts them on a difficult decision-making course where do I believe this person that I trust, this person that I go to work with every day, this person that I play sports with, do I believe that what they're saying is real, or are they a lunatic? And it's good to put a person in a place of decision, because in the end, walking with Jesus is about making a decision. It's about making a decision that yes, Jesus is Lord, or no, he's not. And we don't realize how through our personal testimony, we can help people to get to that decision-making spot where they decide, yes, this Jesus is real, and I better start looking. I better start asking my friend to explain the Bible to me more. I better start asking to get more information, or I'm just going to reject and harden my heart and push away from God even further. And lastly, when sharing our testimony, explain your life after Christ. Explain your life as a result of what Jesus has done in your life or in my life. So do you guys see in the last 3 points, basically the testimony is my life before Christ, my encounter with Jesus, and then my life now as a result of what Jesus has done in my life. Jesus is the one that brought salvation, and as a result of that, there are some things that I can testify and I can say to anyone that's out there, whether it's a coworker, whether it's a friend, I'm able to explain to them some details or some things that are happening now which were not a part of my past. And I remember in Romania on the mission trip with Pastor Antamia a few years back, there was a young man who he had been out on the streets, and hearing his testimony of who he was in the past, a fighter, someone that would knife people, would get into fights, a very violent individual. He had a tattoo that would run up his neck, and even as we met him, it's almost like you were a little bit cautious in regards to who this person was. But then as we heard his testimony, and as we spoke to Brother Catalin, who's overseeing, you were able to tell what a different person he was after his encounter with Jesus Christ. Now, 10, 15 years later, this man that I've kept in touch with is one of the meekest, one of the most soft-spoken, one of the most gentle men that you'll ever meet. And he still goes out on the streets now, and he tells the people that he hung out with before, he tells them about Jesus Christ. And in the last 2 or 3 years that I've known him, there's probably been 5 or 6 incidents where he's gotten punched in the face, where he's gotten his tire slashed on his car, where he's gotten hit with a bottle. And here's a man that was violent, a man that could take care of himself, now has taken on this role of having patience, of winning people over to Christ with love, with compassion, with just showing them the mercy of God through his own life. Share with people your life after Jesus Christ. That's very important. And if we look at the story of this demon-possessed man, I find it very fascinating. He wanted to go be with Jesus. He wanted to be one of the 12 disciples. And Jesus says, no. What do you mean, Jesus? I want to be in ministry. I want to have sermons so that people would be converted, so that people would come to know you. What do you mean I can't follow you? And Jesus says, no. Go back home. Go to your friends, go to your family, and tell them what I've done for you. Hallelujah. But you know what happens when you go back? People say, that's great. It's great to hear about the things that God has done in your life. So you share, but then people get to compare. And if people compare our life before Christ and our life after Christ, they should see a big difference. We're not going to be perfect. We still have imperfections. We're still growing. But there should be a difference in the way that we live life. Our life should be transformed as a result of what Jesus has done. So if before Christ, I was just filled with all sorts of ambitions and all sorts of addictions and things that just pushed me away from the Lord, now people should be able to see that all I want to do is serve God. I want to be a good, godly man or woman that's constantly pursuing the things of God. When people are looking at you and maybe they've heard your personal testimony, do they say, what Daniel says about his past and who he is now, man, that's a big difference. If they're not able to say that, then maybe there should be a question mark in regards to whether I truly encounter Jesus Christ. I want to wrap up here, and I want to encourage you this morning that even though you may not have had the dramatic experience of a Jack Murphy, the con man, who came to know Christ. Even though you may not be like this demon-possessed man who had a violent history and then was at the feet of Jesus, ready to serve, ready to follow Christ, God has given each one of us that have come to know Jesus, He has given us a personal testimony. Hallelujah. Something that you might consider ordinary, but God can use the ordinary in order to do something supernatural and extraordinary. Through that personal testimony, He can do those things in someone else's life. But as you share your testimony, as we have those opportunities, and there are so many ways that you can share a testimony. Someone once said that even if you have 2 minutes, you can use that 2 minutes in order to share your personal testimony. I've never done it that fast, but, there's always a first, and there's always an opportunity to just try that. Also, I've had experiences where I didn't share my full testimony. I saw that a person was going in a certain direction with their mindset and their thinking, so I used a particular area of my life or of the past in order to lead towards spiritual conversation. So you don't have to feel like you have to say everything in one sitting. Create that relationship, create that bond in order to then have conversations over and over again and get closer and closer to sharing the gospel. But remember the principles as you are sharing your testimony. Emphasize the greatness of God. We want to bring people to knowing Jesus Christ, not how bad I was or how great I am now. So we're going to emphasize the greatness of Christ. Number 2, do not allow the enemy to lie to you that your testimony is just too dramatic or that it's just not that big of a deal. Don't allow the enemy to do that. Thirdly, take a snapshot of your past life. Explain, maybe not in great detail, but give an idea of what your life was like before Jesus Christ. Fourthly, give an explanation of how you encountered Jesus Christ, where you were, what happened as you encountered Christ, what you felt in that moment. And fifth, give an explanation or share what your life was like after you encountered Christ. But make sure that as you share that, you allow the people to compare and see, is there really a difference between the man that he was and the man he is now? And may the Lord help us as the world that we're living in is speaking up about all sorts of things, that we would be ready when given the opportunity to speak up and share our personal testimony. Amen.